Hi. I'll use 1 minute to tell a story from earlier this week. I'm actually a substitute here. I wasn't definitely the original intended discussant for this paper. But this happened to me earlier this week when I presented something in front of like 100 biomedical researchers and doctors. And after 2 minutes after I started, and I was talking about very basic stuff like incentives, somebody raised their hand and said, I feel like I'm going down a rabbit hole. And I realized that like the language and the kind of like the parameters with which we speak are just so different. And I'm just a quantitative economist and I don't do small n work. But I know Anne and Susan's work very well, and I know a little bit about Malawi, so I assume that's why I was the first choice substitute. So I apologize for, who knows, right? Maybe fifth. Yeah, who knows? Biju, don't tell me. But I was at least somewhat encouraged by the fact that some of the things that struck me seems to have struck Varun, who is much more kind of in this literature than I am. So let me start by saying I did really like this paper, particularly because we just finished qualitative work in Malawi, and I've been reading like 30 pages each of transcripts like day after day. And one of the things that really strikes me as true is this kind of, even in-depth interviews with excellent interviewers, most of whom are known to Susan very well, you might have probably used them in the past yourself, these awkward silences. So, you read this transcript, there is 2 pages of, I'm not exaggerating, all right, okay, and it goes on and on and on, and you realize, how much it takes in Malawi for someone maybe a little bit more educated than you to get information out of you, right? So in some sense, actually, we can vilify these CDDs, etc., blah, 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 but it's actually, Biju always says this, and I think it's really absolutely true, to do this stuff, you need time, right? And maybe a lot of these people just don't have the time. Their bosses just want them to push out the money, and then that's what gets you up, right? So in some sense, because our trainers, our enumerators are so well trained, and they're trained, they've been like, beaten down to say, you cannot suggest anything. Like, we're after something very particular here, but you cannot say it. They have to say it, right? And so the interviews go on for like 2.5, 3 hours, costing us much more than we originally anticipated. Transcripts are taking 24 hours to transcribe, right? And then it takes me a long time to read, but in the end, what comes out is very little. So in that sense, this was actually quite useful for me to see that even your journalists are kind of like, they're seeing the same things. On the other hand, I kind of also, on the other hand, non-deliberative processes, it seems to me, actually can bring this stuff out if there is respect, right? So my example is that we actually have an intervention going on, and the intervention was not at all deliberative. It was top-down. We designed an experiment, and we ran it. But the person who ran it was a 28-year-old Malawian woman, exactly like you describe. She has braids, she wears earrings, she's on her cell phone all the time. But she ran this program for 2 years. She was in those villages talking to those 1,000 girls every month. When they yelled at her, screamed at her, shouted at her for not getting their money, she patiently kept explaining to them, right? Why this was being done and why it was fair and why it was right. And then explaining them, if I do this exception for you, the next person will come and say, I was sick, I should also get my money. In the end, something spontaneous happened. When this program was ending, and it was kind of ending abruptly for these people, right? They didn't actually know it was, and this is a cash transfer program. They actually spontaneously organized these little parties for her at the last cash transfer program, even though the program was ending, to thank her and to say that, and the things that come out in those discussions, I have RAs, people like Raka sitting over there, who were sometimes at these places, those are the things I want in those transcriptions, right? But I'm not gonna get them by asking. I think it's because these people were treated fairly and humanely for like 2 years, and they really appreciated that, and they just blurted out stuff that I wanna hear. We weren't here for the money, we were actually here because we wanna be like Moniz. We didn't know women can be bosses before. and now we know, it's kind of a role model thing. So these are actually like completely before my actual written comments start, right? So the paper goes through these formal settings, and then the kind of like very formal settings, and then the informal settings. And I actually really struggled with this paper. So on the one hand, I really liked it because, like Varun, I think it's super enjoyable to read. But on the other hand, I couldn't decide what the takeaway message is. And I'm really grateful to Dr. Mansbridge to give some context, because I realized you don't know what you don't know, right? So I'm reading this stuff, and then I have random thoughts, but I can't put them into a framework. And your presentation actually really helped. I was sitting there taking notes, and some of it was, for example, this deliberation bringing out facts. In a lot of these deliberations that you guys seem to enthusiastically write about, I didn't see any facts coming out at all, right? There's this, for example, famous case of the bus discussion on HIV. It's all prejudice being thrown around against Muslims, with Muslims sitting in the bus. It's actually really depressing to me. Right? There's no facts came out. It was all prejudice being thrown about, and then actually nobody learned anything at the end of this discussion, right? To me, right? So in some sense there is examples of it, but then in other senses there's a lot of these stories that I kind of don't know what to make of. There is deliberation, but it's in a context that's really strange to me, and I know Malawi much better than a lot of people here, right? So some of the things I know, a pet peeve of Susan particularly, are these trainings and et cetera that happen with CBOs and CDDs and et cetera. And believe me, they are pervasive. Everybody's aim is to go to one of these things and get the per diems and et cetera. They have a nice example of how like the lunch money for the trainers is twice as much as the participants. These are all true. But on the other hand, I'm not sure all of these things are actually supposed to be deliberative. I don't even think sometimes whoever is running this stuff is actually making the pretense that it's supposed to be deliberative, right? It may have to be. It would be maybe good if it were. But sometimes when I go to a panel econometrics training, I don't want it to be deliberative. I want to learn how to write how to run those regressions. So in some sense, yes, I understand about these trainings, but on the other hand, somebody said earlier this morning, like, do we need deliberation everywhere? Maybe this is one case, maybe they don't.